aid in deliberation, trained moderators. So you have specific guidelines for discussion. There's training panels that are put up around the country for training moderators and some of these things, so that when the public goes in, they don't deliberate in the way that they commonly deliberate in public. They deliberate instead in a space that's considered more ideal. So this is how the philosophy plays out in terms of the actual deployment of these events. My problem is, I think these tend to produce particularly poor data. What we have right now is a lot of data about how good or interesting or what kinds of outputs you'd get if this is the way that public decision making happened, which of course it isn't. The whole idea is it's counterfactual. Data sets I think are generated are weak for a number of reasons. First of all, these are artificial and idealized spaces, right? There's little or no ecological validity really for the kind of data that we're looking at. And if we're talking about communication and deliberation, ecology bears large in what we're talking about. This isn't really a situation in which individual psychology reigns supreme, but it's a situation in which the interaction dynamics and the ways that different kinds of relationships play out within these spaces, the ecologies, the social ecologies, have enormous influence. So because they've focused on the building of an artificial ecology, a more ideal ecology, there's really no way to extrapolate from these into the broader ecology. It treats individuals largely as static and independent of that actual lived context that's going on. And what I mean by this is, in most of the representative sampling, the idea is to pull people out of the context in which they live, put them in a different context. How many of us live in contexts of perfectly representative populations? Right, no one does, right? I mean, in terms of your day-to-day interactions, it pulls them out of that actual lived context and studies them instead in a different context, which is another type of problem with ecological validity. It also tends to vacate or hide the centrality of rhetoric in shaping perception and opinion. Because it's focused on the idea of producing more ideally deliberative communication, it tends to downplay the capacity for rhetoric. Although, if you go back and you read the incidents and you watch what happens in these events, the turning point moments are most often the times when somebody stands up and says, "My mother was affected by this." And they exhibit incredible rhetorical prowess, right? Incredible persuasive skill, and it's a moving turning point in that moment, even though it's exactly the kind of thing, and usually very personal and very private in terms of the, but that kind of rhetorical prowess and skill tends to get downplayed under the idea that we have a more rational, deliberative, ideal model for participation. The models also have a tendency to fail in the United States, and most of the people who work in deliberative democracy have started to recognize this, and there are some really basic reasons for this. The first is we lack baseline commonalities in this country. Even Jürgen Habermas said this. He said, look, you know, some of the European countries are really good. They have certain baseline commonalities that tend to dominate in the culture in these countries, and as a result, you put them in deliberative spaces like this, it's functional. But Habermas said he didn't think his theory would work very well in the United States or in Soviet Union. This interview took place prior to the fall of the Soviet Union, because they lack baseline commonalities. And you think about the cultural differences between the United States and the Western European nations, and you can just reference back to something like Dietram Scheufele's charts on religiosity from yesterday. It's a pretty simple kind of concept, right? You can't just kind of externalize from what goes on in Western Europe into the United States and expect that to work. Hicks has noted this in his studies. Darren Hicks noted this in terms of talking about democracy and deliberation. Like I said, Habermas noted it, and the international differences are rife as well. Second, external artificial force has been required to produce and sustain participation. You know, less than 40% of American publics believe that elected officials care about what they think. That study was done by Lukensmeyer, Goldman, and Brigman that indicated the vast majority of the public doesn't see any outcome to their public participation. In addition to that, almost all the deliberative democracy public engagement events at the point that the funding dried up and the grant went away, they collapsed. There was a sustained, really interesting project done in Philadelphia that was funded in part by a newspaper there. They tried to hand it over to the citizen groups. When they handed it over to the citizen groups, they had a disagreement, dissension. They no longer had an external power structure providing funding and guidance for them. It fell apart. Key stakeholders also tend to find little value in the results. Crosby and Nethercutt actually cite this as one of the reasons and Hendricks has talked about this as well, that some of the places and some of the people who were doing deliberative democracy, public engagement in this country shut down, stopped doing it. The Jefferson Institute, which owns the trademark on citizen juries in this country, shut down a few years ago because nobody was interested in having them do any more citizen juries because the stakeholders didn't find value in it. These types of events have had little to no policy impact in this country, and the people who organize them and run them and are deeply invested in them oftentimes lament exactly this problem. Even when you bring policymakers to them, it doesn't tend to change the decisions that the policymakers make. This is especially problematic, I think, in terms of emerging technologies like nanotechnology. First, because participants lack sufficient awareness and understanding of the technology, and I certainly don't need to cite sources here. We've heard I don't know how many of them over the period of yesterday and today. The very idea that people could even basically define what nanotechnology is. Fair and balanced presentations also do not reflect how risk perceptions are shaped outside of artificial constraints. Right now, what we're experiencing is largely a honeymoon or euphoria period in the media. New technologies emerge, they have wild possibilities, extraordinary expectations are set upon them, and there are very, very positive reports in the newspapers. It's not fair and balanced information. And when stakeholders and interest groups interact with the public, when the public reads media reports or encounters that kind of stuff, they don't receive fair and balanced information. So actual perceptions of risk are shaped on the basis of biased information, conflicted information, and information from a variety of different kinds of sources, angles, and perspectives. Also, I think the analogs become contentious, and we don't have any actual events to shape perception. What I mean by this, by analogs, is whenever we talk about a new emerging technology like nanotechnology, we try to make analogs, plastic, asbestos, etc. All of these analogs, as Dietrich's talked about, provide framing influence and are contentious. They're controversial. We have no previous events to talk about in terms of nanotechnology as a catalyst for public opinion. And we don't have any particular good, solid material to hand them or show them. Finally, the benefit values of emerging tech are often unrealistically high or very vague. And right now I would say we are in the unrealistically high phase for nanotechnology. Some of the discourse about it indicates that it will solve every problem ever known to humankind, from resource scarcity to environmental pollution to aging. So we've got a problem in terms of how we talk about doing engagement events, because the model's not going to be able to produce the kind of data most of us are interested in looking at, and the model's also particularly amplified in its problems when it starts being done in relation to emerging technology. So